Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard Gaming. I'm kicking off 2025 with a review of another Anbernic device. This time up, it's the Anbernic RG34XX, which is Anbernic's newest device as I record this, and it looks like the original Game Boy Advance. Mostly. Even if you've seen some of the other reviews for this device, you might want to stick with me on this one, since I talk about a few things that are not widely covered in some of the other videos. Also, while I appreciate how in-depth some other people go in their reviews, I'm going to keep this one short and sweet and cover just the stuff that I think people will really care about. First up, the normal disclosures. This RG34XX was sent to me for review by twizzler.com. They are not seeing this review before it goes up, nor do they have any input into it whatsoever. As always, the thoughts expressed here are entirely my own. One more disclosure. 2Retro has set up this 10% off code for viewers of this video, and no, I do not get any money if you decide to buy it from them. If you want to purchase from them with a 10% off code, you can use the code EngelbardGaming on the site. Just as a note, I decline all affiliate offers that involve selling products that I review, since I feel that if I took money for any product purchases that people decide to make, that would call the integrity of my reviews into question. I'm not judging or calling out anybody else, that's just how I feel like I should do things. Okay, on to the main event. Before I even begin, let me tell you that once again, this is another Anbernic device powered by the H700 chipset, also found in many of their other devices, such as the RG35XX SP, the RG40XXV, and most recently the RG Cube XX. That makes this the 9th Anbernic portable device with this chipset. So join me and I'll let you know who this is for, whether it's worth the money, and whether or not you should pick this up if you already have another Anbernic device. First off, I really like the look and feel of the RG34XX. I should note that I got the purple one to match my original Game Boy Advance, but if you think that's the only color you can get it in, well, you're wrong! It's also available in solid black, transparent green, transparent red, and just glacier officially as of a few days ago. And while it's basically a clone design-wise of the original Game Boy Advance's appearance, Anbernic did make some pretty thoughtful changes to it. Old hands start to hurt and creak with handheld systems that are too thin these days. The extra girth of the 34XX makes it pleasant to hold for long periods of time. But let's talk about everything that's changed from the original GBA. Aside from the thickness, there are 2 extra face buttons, which serve as X and Y for general system usage, and there's an extra set of shoulder buttons, L2 and R2, up on top. Also on top, we have the menu and reset buttons, along with the USB-C charging port and a mini HDMI out port. In between the L2 and R2 buttons, we have the now traditional 2 micro SD card slots. The left one is for the operating system, and the right one is for the card that holds your ROMs. As a quick note, Anbernic has configurations with preloaded ROMs yet again, and these may be illegal in the country where you live, so buyer beware on that one, and I really wish they'd stop doing it already. But back to the device itself. On the bottom we have the power button, a 3.5mm headphone jack, and a weird sort of volume rocker. It looks like a wheel, but it just slides left and right a limited amount. You've probably seen buttons like it before. Going back to the front of the unit, we have a 3:2 aspect ratio IPS screen. This one has a resolution of 720 by 480. To the left of that we have the D-pad and the start and select buttons. To the right we have the 4 face buttons and a single front-facing speaker. Now the original GBA of course had only 2 face buttons, and I like the way that Anbernic has gone about giving us 2 extra buttons, but sort of hid them by making them the same color as the case and not labeling them. Now the D-pad is a little bit looser than the standard GBA pad, which I think in this case is a pretty good thing, especially considering its small size. Overall, when it comes to look and feel, I have to say Anbernic totally nailed it, and I love the visual design and comfort of the 34XX. Now before I get into performance, I'm going to answer one of the questions I posed earlier. Who is the RG34XX for? Because the hardware is the same as 8 other recent-ish Anbernic devices. So there's really only 2 types of gamers I'd say this one is for. The first are those who are really nostalgic for the original GBA form factor. The 34XX more than scratches the itch for those who want to play on something that feels like the original system, despite the few changes that have been made. The other type of gamer this is for are GBA fans in general, because there aren't too many devices out there with a 3:2 aspect ratio screen. The original GBA was 3:2, which is a slightly wider image than the 4:3 TVs of the time displayed. And I have to say, once again, I love seeing this in a new handheld and being able to play GBA games without black bars either on the sides or the top and bottom of the screen, or having to stretch the image. The IPS panel has great viewing angles, and the resolution of 720 by 480 is perfectly fine for its small size. Also, there's another few bonuses really. Games for 4x3 systems like the SNES and Genesis actually look pretty decent even when stretched to full screen on this ratio. They look a little wider than normal, of course, but nowhere near as bad as when stretched on a 16x9 screen. Speaking of 16x9, PSP games actually look pretty nice on here too. Now keep in mind the H700 system on a chip this device uses isn't exactly a powerhouse, so you won't be able to play every PSP game out there. Plus, there's no analog stick, which is also a factor. But for games that work fine, they actually look pretty nice on this screen. They're only shrunk just a little bit. PSP games look terrible when squashed to 4x3 in my opinion, or when you have huge black bars above and below them. But on this 3x2 screen, they are more than acceptable. So in this case, even if you have other Anbernic handhelds or ones from competing companies, you might want to consider one of these devices for the screen aspect ratio alone. Okay, for performance, I'm not gonna beat a dead horse here. If you've seen any of my other videos on H700 devices, you know what you're getting. Essentially everything PlayStation and below should work pretty much flawlessly. Here's just a snippet of footage from some 8 and 16-bit console systems to start with. I should note, you can turn the filters and overlays on and off as you please. I did with some and not with others. With NES and SNES, I found they looked pretty great stretched to full screen, and I made that change in the standard RetroArch settings. For Genesis and SMS, at least for now, I left them as they were, which in this case means they use a default overlay. So as we look at these, I will mention a few of the cons of the system too, since it's definitely not perfect. While it mimics the size and proportions of the GBA aside from thickness, the screen is really small by modern standards. If you're getting on in years, like me, and this device appeals to your nostalgia, you might find you have a hard time reading text in some games. It's not too bad, but honestly, it's the one thing that I wish Anbernic would have changed the most. I would have traded a slightly larger screen size for that bit of nostalgia, personally. And even though it's accurate, having only one speaker isn't the greatest these days either. But at least it is front-firing, so props to them for that. And it sure does get plenty loud. It's not very clear, but it's alright. The only other issue I have with this system is the placement of the L2 and R2 buttons, and a few of the other menu buttons and stuff. L2 and R2 are kinda hard to reach, and I don't feel like they're really in a natural position. I also found that the reset and menu buttons were a little more out of the way than I personally would have liked. Anyway, as you can see here, GBA games look fantastic on the 34XX, and they are the main draw of a system like this. Here's Castlevania Circle of the Moon. This one holds a special place in my heart, since it was the first GBA game I ever played. I bought it with the system the day it launched at a Toys R Us in the same parking lot as where I used to work as a web developer back then. Of course, the original GBA didn't have a backlit screen, so I got home to my apartment at the time and was playing under a bright lamp, but still thought it was awesome. Take a moment to look at just a few other GBA games before I rejoin you here. Finally, I'll wrap this section up with a little PSP footage. As I mentioned earlier, not every game will run at full speed, but some will. Check out Daria's Burst here. It looks and plays awesome on this thing. Even Wipeout Pure runs pretty nice all things considered, although it does look like it has to do some shader caching or something the first time you see certain parts of the game or effects. So it does stop for a split second or two a few times, usually early in a race, and then runs pretty well after that. And I didn't show you any of them this time, but you'll be able to play a few, but not all Dreamcast games on here too, as shown in my prior Anbernic H700 device reviews. Saturn is a no-go on this chipset though. Also, as usual for this chipset, listen to this part. It's super important. Do not, I repeat, do not launch your games through the Game Room option. It's the first option in the menu. Launch them through RetroArch instead. Why? Because as with all Anbernic's other H700 devices, Anbernic applies filters and effects that slow games down, and they often use older, buggier versions of the emulators. My example here, as always, is Arcade Strider, which aside from hefty frame skipping, where there should be none at all on a chipset this powerful, also has some minor game logic issues. If you launch through RetroArch instead, you won't have any of these problems. Lastly, the 34XX battery life is rated at 7 hours, slightly higher than most of Anbernic's other H700 devices, and it absolutely gets around that range. In fact, I've gone about 9 hours at relatively low brightness and still had roughly half a charge, according to the built-in indicator. Now, I recorded all the video here at relatively low brightness to help things look good on camera, but at standard brightness, if you aren't playing only high-end systems like Dreamcast or PSP all the time, you should get somewhere in that 7-hour range with the brightness set to 4 out of 5. So here's my summary and review of the Anbernic 34XX. Anbernic has put out a lot of devices over the course of the last year, many with the same chipset found in their latest device here, the RG34XX. I mentioned in some prior videos what separates the systems now is primarily form factor and specialization. The RG34XX has a form factor that closely, but not perfectly, mimics the original Game Boy Advance. It's thicker and has some extra buttons, but I think the physical changes that Anbernic made are primarily for the better, honestly. Performance is fine for the price, which is between $70 and $110 depending on where you buy and what you buy it with. The 34XX accomplishes at least 2 things that make it worth owning in my opinion. First up, it definitely will hit you in the feels if you love the original GBA and spent hours playing it more than 2 decades ago. Second, the 3x2 screen is not only an ideal way to play GBA games, but it's also probably the best universal screen ratio for classic systems and even newer ones, since the minor stretch on 4x3 games doesn't look bad at all when you make them full screen, and the minor squish on 16x9 games doesn't look bad at all either. The Anbernic 34XX is another nice device from Anbernic, and I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. This one almost stretched into 9 out of 10 territory, but the small screen, a bit of awkwardness to the button layout, that single front-firing speaker, and the small D-pad held it back just a smidge. I know some of these things are accurate to the original device, but I still have to call them out on a modern device like this one. Otherwise, I think this is a great little machine, and it's definitely worth adding to a handheld collection for both original GBA diehards and people who just want something small with a screen that accommodates a lot of different aspect ratios pretty well. Alright, so now it's your turn. What do you all think? Do you have a 34XX? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Do you wish Anbernic would move on to different chipsets already? Tell me all about it in the comments. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like it and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss any of my videos. If you want to help support the work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon, through Ko-fi, or right here on YouTube through things like Super Thanks and channel memberships. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.